Good afternoon. My name is Stella Flores, and thank you again for the invitation to come to APPAM. This is actually my first APPAM conference, and if I knew it was going to be so exciting, I would have come many years prior. But hope to consistently come from now on. So I was asked to consider implications of the Fisher versus UT Austin case. So I'll focus this talk on 3 points, actually 4 points, surrounding the case, some of which may or may not matter to the court's decision, but certainly matter to the state of educational attainment, the representation of underrepresented minorities in colleges and universities, and to leadership development in the United States. These are the role of demography, which I call the D word, which is actually, I'm a little surprised it hasn't been mentioned more throughout the day. So demography in regard to the student population, an analysis of the arguments made by the 72 amicus friend of the court briefs to the Supreme Court, the stakeholders who constructed these arguments, and these are from Ivy League deans to members of the U.S. Congress to one of the largest community colleges in the nation. So a wide array of stakeholders who submitted a brief on behalf of the University of Texas at Austin. And then end with implications for attending to or ignoring these arguments and the vast multidisciplinary and rigorous research that are at the foundation for these arguments. So, I know you can't see the scale, but trust that the darker areas represent a particular student. So in this case, on the left, we have share of Hispanic high school graduates in 2008 by Texas. I'm using Texas as a demographic case study. So on the left you have Hispanics, the darker the brown, the higher the area, the percentage or share of high school graduates by school district, and the map on the right is the share of black high school graduates. So we've talked a lot about pipeline. I like to frame it in terms of eligible pool of students ready for colleges and universities. So if people ask, well, where are all the underrepresented minorities? They're right here. Here's a map, right? And you can do that with any state in the nation. You contact your local GIS. I used to make these myself, and then I found someone who does it much faster and better than I do. And if you think about just in terms of organizations, if you want to locate students, this is a very quick and easy way, and I find it speaks to policymakers quite vividly. So let's start with that, thinking about that. So why should we care about demography, Texas, and the nation? Texas has had the greatest population growth in the nation from 2000 to 2010. It's also registered the second largest number of Hispanics after California and the third largest number of black individuals after New York and California. The Hispanic case, or Latino case, whatever word you use, I'm from Texas, so I grew up using Hispanics, and when I moved to the Northeast, we used Latinos. Hispanics are the largest minority in the nation's college campuses, 2- and 4-year colleges. This is a major demographic shift when Hispanics have become the largest minority at both 2- and 4-year colleges. What have we seen in terms of enrollment? Our analysis of Texas data, we use state administrative data out of Texas. We found that there's obviously a large increase in high school graduation rates for Hispanics and for black students. They reached record highs in the past few years. But what we've seen is that whereas there's been an increase in African American college enrollment, what the state might consider impressive, it's gone to the community college sector. And when we had looked at transfer rates, who is the group least likely to transfer with very dismal, in fact, I think, despicable transfer rates, is black students in Texas. So while they're enrolling, they're going to community colleges and they're not transferring. In terms of Hispanic students, they represent the largest increase in all high school graduate cohorts, yet they're still not enrolling in college, and we analyzed 6 cohorts over time when we control for pre-college and curricular factors. So that's the demography of Texas. It's likely to represent the demography of many other big states. Now, if we talk about the Fisher case, we had 72 amicus briefs in support of UT Austin, and this is developing work with my colleagues at University of Pennsylvania, University of Maryland, and University of Hawaii. We analyzed the 72 briefs, and something happened in the PC transfer, so there should be 1, 2, 3, 4. I apologize for that. And these are the 4 themes that came out across the 72 briefs. Race and racism still matter in American life and education. Diversity is a compelling state interest because of what it yields in terms of educational workforce benefits. And then the last two, which I'll focus on, and I won't go too deep into the third one because I believe Professor Laurie is going to talk about race-neutral programming as well. But affirmative action is the most viable option for achieving sufficient diversity on college campuses and subsequently the workforce and leadership. This is essentially the mechanism argument. Various multidisciplinary and mostly econometric studies have studied the effect of race-neutral programming, and they all tend to say the same thing. It doesn't increase race and ethnic representation at selective colleges and universities, and it does nothing to recover what this rate was before the bans on affirmative action. The other mechanism, if you think about in terms of three mechanisms, is race neutral. The other one is the bans on affirmative action, which is actually, if you want to think about it in terms of an anti-diversity policy, they all yield what we expected to yield, a decrease in the representation of mostly black students, but also Hispanic students at selective colleges and universities. Also, very fine econometric studies, they all find the same thing. And the third one is what I call the natural mechanism. So just the increase in demography. We have so many more Hispanics graduating from high school. So when we do see a rate increase, and I know this is a policy crowd, so I know you understand that just demography doesn't mean an effective program. Well, it means, right? I mean, I usually have to go into detail and explain why a descriptive trend doesn't mean your program hasn't been effective. So those are all those mechanisms, right? And none of them have worked as well as affirmative action. So even if you remove yourself from the politics of this, I still don't know of an effective mechanism other than what was in place prior. And then finally, the role of legal precedent. The court should not depart from the decision established by Grutter. And by this, I mean the expanded role of state interest. And by compelling state interest, in the Grutter case, we saw a few briefs, very impressive and interesting briefs come from the U.S. military and from the Fortune 500 companies. In this case with the Fisher, we saw some of that as well, but we also saw from the Association of Basketball Coaches, right? And then we saw from various members of Congress, from various members of the Senate, all saying it is a compelling state interest to have leadership in our communities come from a racially diverse population. So we think about where leadership has expanded, right, in terms of the military is very much framed as a national security issue, and now it's expanding, at least in written word, and in these arguments in Fisher case, to other areas. And then finally, this idea that we had this comprehensive higher education voice supporting the University of Texas at Austin. Who were these groups? They were in education and out, but these are the stakeholders that we analyze that played a part. Where I am on time. Okay. So we had various education groups, associations, and think tanks, federal, state, municipal officials. We grouped them into these 9 entities. And the group that I thought was quite important was this idea of the multiple identities of post-secondary institutions, including administrators and faculty. Liliana was part of the social scientist brief, and others put in a brief as well, and then individuals with a historic and social perspective on the case. So individuals such as, I'm sorry, I blanked on the name. I blanked on the name. I'm a terrible civil rights scholar. I'll get back to
the civil rights.
Yes. The family.
LDF.
Yeah. I'll get back. The Sweat family. Yes. Sorry. I'll be paying for that for a while now. I'm sorry. So these are the various groups that submitted a brief, right? What I want to point you to, because we've been talking a lot about what can institutions do, is the group of institutions who actually submitted a brief, and we found 5 profiles groups. We call it, first one is the Brown University et al. Group, Ivy League institutions, University of Chicago, Vanderbilt, among others. Then we have the leading public research universities, mostly from the Midwest, leading research institutions, University of Michigan, MSU, Penn State, among others. Then we have the Catholic University Group, and they submit a very interesting brief as well, really focusing on this idea of academic freedom and maintaining the role of deference to universities as established by the Grutter case. And then this really interesting group from Appalachian State to a number of HBCUs, all claiming we're all four-year institutions, we all have very diverse missions, we all need to, arguing that they need to maintain their autonomy to select the student bodies that are appropriate for them. And obviously, what does Appalachian State have in common with the HBCU group? Well, they found some commonalities. Finally, the Houston Community College System, and their argument was based on its role as a transfer institution, based on who they tend to enroll and where they're located. Most of its transfers tend to be overwhelmingly underrepresented students. And then the University of California system, we saw this as sort of the global system in the world, right? They have a global effect in terms of higher education presence, but they're also under this voter referendum to ban affirmative action. So those are the stakeholders, those are the arguments, those are the general summary of research studies. I'm going to leave you with some thoughts on implications, which mean, in my opinion, demography matters. Whether or not it's considered a viable legal argument, Texas has recognized it's a critical economic imperative. This idea, again, that race-neutral admission policies, they do not increase racial and ethnic diversity as elite public colleges and universities, and the bans certainly exacerbate the outcome of underrepresentation. And then finally, to what extent does evidence of a comprehensive post-secondary institutional voice, assessments by key professional, legal, and education scholars, and rigorous research on the effects of major diversity or anti-diversity programs matter in the decision to uphold the use of race as one factor of consideration in college admissions? That's a long sentence, but I'm asking you to consider, what if none of this matters to the court? How do we move forward as individuals at colleges and universities? And what does that mean when none of this matters? I'll stop there.